How's it going, guys? Getting started with this Q&A. We're waiting until we get at least a few people on here watching live. And if you have any questions whatsoever, I'm here as an open book resource for you. I'm just going to take some time and answer your questions and answer a few that I've already been sent in from the post that I made earlier. Say hi in the comments so I know that you are there. All right, looks like we've got a pretty good group going now. Hope everybody's doing good. Having a good, was it Monday today? Yeah, Monday most of the day today. Got a few things that I wanted to talk about. Be sure that you are commenting down below. And please, somebody let me know if you can hear me okay. I'm trying out a new mic right now. Waiting for confirmation that you guys can hear me okay. Thank you, Charlotte. I'm not sure how I feel about being food right now, but thank you. One of the first things that I wanted to talk about was when we talk about exercise technique. One of the big things that a lot of people run into, and especially a lot of my clients when they first start working with me, is it doesn't matter how many good techniques that you know and how many cues a coach can give you. If you're being told to hit a position and you physically don't have the tools to hit that position, whether it's strength in certain areas of your hips, your back, your abdomen, anything like that, or you're just too tight in the opposing areas. If you have tight inner thighs and your adductors, you're not going to be able to spread your knees apart very well. So it doesn't matter how strong your back is or how strong your outer hips are, your abductors. You're just not going to be able to hold that position, and you end up with your knees collapsing. Same thing with your hip extensors. If your hamstrings are tight, your glutes are tight, and a combination of that with a weaker lower back, which most of us have from sitting and typing all day and working in a seated position, especially if you have a sedentary job, those things are really a big problem. So if you take video of yourself, which I recommend everybody does, watch for those things, your knees coming in and your lower back grounding on lower body exercises or any movement, lunges, rear foot elevated split squats, anything like that. If you watch all those things happening and you're really trying to force and make those positions work, but it's just not happening, that's probably why. The mobility and strength aren't in the right places at that point for that movement to be done correctly. So you really need to start focusing on the mobility aspects of that. The same thing can happen with upper body as well. It's just super prevalent with lower body because of the way most of us are in society now, and we're sitting a lot and not moving around as much. A good example of that is when you're doing bench press. I'll see if I can fit this in the frame. When you go down, you always want to keep your wrist stacked over top of your elbow, because if you're here, you're actually going to start causing external rotation on the shoulder. And what that does, causes rotator cuff strain and sometimes tears. So you want to be able to, instead of being here, if you're looking from the top down, you would be there, have the wrist directly over the elbow. And if you go down, 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 and you start getting close to the chest with the bar or the dumbbells, and you all of a sudden feel that normally means that your pec, either major or minor, but mostly major, is too tight to be able to hold this position with that weight. And if that happens, when you do this, with the insertion of the pec going into the shoulder and turning down like this, going from there to there will actually take tension out of the pec major, so to allow you to hit that bottom position a little bit more comfortably. So if you notice that kind of a movement pattern in your lifts, it might be a good thing to start stretching out your pecs, especially if you bench with a high bar placement on bench press, to make sure you get as much pec stimulation as possible. So just little tips like that in general is some things that can help you avoid injuries, and will also help you make sure that you are getting as much out of the exercises as you should results-wise, because if you start having compensating mechanics, things like bouncing out of the bottom of a squat, or bouncing the bench press and everything being loose and your knees wavering all over the place, that completely changes the motor patterns and how your muscles are firing. And it starts developing things in weird ways. You start getting weak points and all kinds of crazy stuff. So just keep an eye out for those things. And we'll move on to the next thing. Got a little list here. I'm starting to get some comments now. This is good. Glad to see you guys interacting there. Marco, patellar tendonitis. Granted, I'm not a PT, so this is purely from anecdotal and some anatomical, logic for the most part. Most patellar tendonitis, in my experience, has been caused by some form of quad tightness. So, if you don't squat all the way down very often, if you, squat a few inches above parallel repeatedly, then you're only getting to maybe 90 degrees knee flexion in the bottom of the squat. And that chronically over time, especially if you run on top of that, that's a compounding issue. That combination and anything where you're just not hitting a full range of motion in knee flexion is really going to start shortening your quads. That makes them tight. And while you may feel super strong in that range of motion specifically, that tightness is going to start pulling on the tendons that go down over the knee joint, which has the kneecap in it. So if you imagine this is the knee joint, here's the cap, my hand here is the tendon or the quad pulling on it. You go down and you sit, it's literally pulling the kneecap on top of the knee joint with a lot more tension, just driving it down onto the surface of the knee joint. And the cartilage underneath the patella is not going to like that for very long. It's going to start getting inflamed, and you can have some cartilage tears underneath there. Some people, you can eventually have a slap tear, and it feels like your knee's going to lock up. So a big thing is you can do some manual release with that. People use the Theraguns, where they're basically jigsaws with a little ball on the end, and you can work that into the muscle area. I personally, instead of using foam rollers or anything like that, I'll use a barbell. I'll just take the barbell, sit down on the bench, and I'll roll over especially the lower half of the quadricep. And that'll help break apart, maybe some myofascial adhesions and whatever scar tissue might be around there. And on top of that, all that manual manipulation really accentuates the effect of stretching. If you can stretch with a little bit of vibration, like the Theragun I was talking about, or any kind of vibration in general, it seems to help acute flexibility increases. But if you have lots of acute flexibility increases consistently with doing mobility over time, you have a chronic training adaptation and your tension in the quads will go away. Most of the time that takes away patellar pain or patella tendonitis. So I've had that happen a whole lot with clients. Let's see what else we got here. Well, you guys are following in. This is good. All right, Mike Gordon, low back issues. What is the cause of low back fatigue? After some sets, the low back feels tired enough that it makes it difficult to stand up or walk. Again, no pain, just fatigue. Okay, interesting. If it feels like your low back is super, super tight, it can be a lot of different things because there's so many dimensions of movement with the lower back, and there's so many things that could end up causing it. I was actually just talking to one of my friends the other day. We were discussing how the piriformis is one of the smaller muscles that's actually underneath your glute max, up towards the top of your hip, but it actually attaches to the SI joint, and I forgot what part of the hip that actually inserts to, but it actually pulls on your SI joint. And when those get tight, if you have a SI joint, you have a piriformis here, a piriformis here, if this side gets tight, it starts turning it and pulling it. And when that happens, you start getting spine issues that are turning around, and you get a lot of inflammation and sciatica and issues like that. But if you have compression, if you're sitting a lot and you start to feel that real big low back pump, a lot of us call it, you can have occlusion issues where everything is compressed and the blood is actually not able to flow through there very well. And one of the best answers for that I've had personally was using an inversion table. And I put up a demo not long ago about how to use an inversion table, but looping a band around the foot pegs to where it will go around your hips, kind of like a dip belt. And when you turn upside down, instead of the inversion table holding on to your feet and your ankles, which is super uncomfortable for me, it will actually pull on your hips and allow your upper body to relax. And when you can actually relax, that's when spinal decompression happens, and hopefully it'll open up that blood flow area for you. Charlotte, RP planning a workout program for postpartum women, emphasis on pelvic floor exercises. I haven't heard anything specifically about that, but we have some projects with breastfeeding templates right now for diet, so I can at least give you that right now. We'll look into the exercise program for that, though. Good question. Let's see. Trying to find these other questions. It's not showing up on my laptop right now. Okay. So another issue is when using with really high rep schemes, 10s and especially 15s. I program those a fair amount for my clients, especially towards the end of a cut phase, because that it keeps the calorie expenditure high, and you're going to get a lot of metabolite accumulation, as well as just a really good hypertrophy stimulus from compound lifts going that higher in volume. But with those really high rep schemes, it gets kind of hard to figure out what your relative effort is, because if you're doing a three or four sets of 15, that first set is actually going to feel really easy all the way through most of the time, because a weight that you can get through and do 15 straight reps with, and eventually do close to 50 reps with if it's 4 sets. The difference in fatigue from the first set to the last set is going to be really, really big. So I have people all the time saying that, the weight feels super easy, I'm just getting really out of breath. It's not that my muscles are tired, it's just I can't breathe. And that is still one of the aspects of the lift. That's one, that's kind of the limiting factor. So when you pick your weights for those rep schemes, make sure you take that into account. The first set's going to feel very easy, but by the end of it, you may be feeling like a completely different person. You won't even know that person that started the first set. You'll be completely, amnesia of that person. But another question was lifting and doing tempo sets versus lifting as explosively as possible. There are a lot of pros and cons there. And with tempo lifting, I only use that for beginners, essentially, because when you slow everything down, you are trying to emphasize technique most of the time. And you're trying to, just for instance, a squat, you're going to go down at a certain rate, which is slow and controlled. And the biggest thing is trying to hold posture and trying to keep your knees in the right place, keep everything balanced, and you're practicing technique. As far as strength adaptations, if you are a beginner, you're certainly going to get them. Intermediate, maybe. If you're really advanced, and especially if you're not using enhancing supplements, it's not going to be that great of a benefit to you, because when you are already past that point of learning the technique and refining it, and you have good technique, you don't necessarily need to practice it that exclusively anymore unless you have mobility issues. There are ways to work around that and emphasize it in your training. But the big thing is when you lift intentionally slowly, you have muscle fiber adaptations that are very different from the way it should be if you're trying to become as explosive or as powerful or as strong as possible. If you ever look at a biopsy slide of muscle tissue, you can look this up on Google, it's pretty easy to find. When you see a cluster of muscle fibers, on a slide, a type 1 muscle fiber might be about this big, not too big. And a type 2A muscle fiber, which is not the most powerful, but it's significantly more powerful than a type 1, which is endurance oriented, and it's oxidative, so it has mitochondria in it. A type 2A muscle fiber is going to get about this big. And from there, you start having hybrids between 2A and 2X, and they can range in size, but if you really want to focus on strength, in general, you have to develop 2X fibers as much as possible. And that only comes when you lift with as much intent as you possibly can. And those eventually grow, significantly larger than the 2As. And the reason that is there is a neural threshold. When an electrical signal is sent into the muscle, if you have a low electrical signal or neural signal, it's only going to activate, a few motor units, just enough to get the job done. And if you start lifting with more intent or lifting a heavier weight, then you're going to increase the number of motor units that you're bringing into play and activating. And those are going to start being on a graded scale. Low motor unit activation, endurance fibers, just like walking and things like that. If you start trying to run or jog, you're going to start incorporating a few more, especially if you're out of shape like me and can't run anywhere. But you're going to start activating more of those 2A type fibers. And when you start activating all the motor units with an all-out effort, lifting explosively and moving as forcefully as possible, that is when you start catching the threshold and meeting the requirement to activate those 2X fibers. And if you do that consistently and often enough, those 2X fibers start proliferating. You get more and more and more and more of them. And that's how you really become strong and powerful without gaining, significant size. If you're in weight class sports, that's super, super important. So you might want to be careful if you're doing too much tempo stuff and you're in a weight class sport particularly. Shane, I assume that's Shane. I love you too, man. Hope to see you sometime soon. Still having a hard time seeing these comments. See if I can find them on my phone better. All right, Caleb, good question on the abs. I don't normally prescribe direct ab work. I give ab work guidelines. I have 3 primary exercises that I suggest for ab work. One is using ab rollouts with the little handle and the wheel, and you start on your knees and you roll out and roll back, extend your arms all the way out. That gives a really, really good eccentric load on the abs. So it's just like lowering a dumbbell on a bicep curl. You're doing kind of the same thing with your abs with the weight, just due to physics and leverage, going out and really creating a lot of stress on the abdomen, and then you roll back. You're not actually changing the angle of the muscle a whole lot, but the stress goes way up. The second would be doing sit-ups with an arched back on a GHD or glute ham developer. The reason that works is you actually get spinal flexion and extension really, really well. And when you go back, if you're sitting up like that and about to do a sit-up, you arch your back and you can actually extend all the way back and then come up. And it gives you the right mechanics to allow those muscle fibers to get a lot of tension in the bottom and develop the primary stimulus for hypertrophy, which is that tension when those muscle fibers are starting to pull longitudinally and activate, satellite cell proliferation and, the secrets of growth. But probably most everybody doesn't want to listen to. Charlotte, I actually just graduated with my PhD I just walked in December. So my time with Mike was actually spent in Boone, North Carolina at Appalachian State when he was getting his master's degree, and I was wrapping up my undergrad. So when he got done with ETSU, I followed suit in that same program not long after. All right, Tyler, you've got a question. What's the best way through cuts and exercise to start to wither away the tummy pouch and love handles? Well, there's no easy answer for this one, unfortunately, because when you gain weight or you gain body fat, we have different genetic predispositions as to where that body fat's going to be stored at. So whether it's going to be stored in your stomach, for a lot of the ladies, it's stored in the hips. Everyone's genetics are different for that. So, but even though we store it at different rates in different locations, so it's going to accumulate in specific areas more. When we start losing body fat, you lose it uniformly throughout your body. That's why it feels like when you start dieting, places like your shoulders, and for men, a lot of times your legs, you have spots that seem like they get leaner faster. But it's really only because you didn't gain as much body fat in those specific areas. And if you lose a millimeter of body fat in one area, it's generally going to be a millimeter of body fat everywhere. Whereas you might gain 5 millimeters of body fat in your stomach and only 1 or 2 in your shoulders. So that's kind of what creates that illusion that you're going to have specific problem areas. And it sucks, but when you have uneven distribution levels and everything goes down at the same time, even if your arms are down at 3%, but you store a lot of body fat in your belly and that pooch that you were talking about, if you're still at like a 10% level there or higher, you're still going to have to keep working down, and it will eventually come off, but it's just going to take longer. I wish I had a better story to tell for that one, but that's just the way it is. Let's see. Catherine's wondering about cutting before a sprint race, 2K, I assume meter row, and after amassing and building strength over the winter. I assume that this is a sport-specific issue. So the rowers that I've talked about, they have specific weight limits. Now, one way or another, being sport specific, you have specific goals. If you have to meet a weight limit, then that's just what you have to do. The downside to cutting before a sprint race would be the accumulation of fatigue is going to be higher. And when that happens, the adaptations to training, specifically strength training, and especially on average for women due to your physiology and endocrinology patterns, the adaptations are going to be geared more towards those smaller type 1 fibers. And for that event, it might not be that bad, but you're talking about a sprint, so you need a lot more type 2 fibers. So just like most other sporting events that are weight class oriented or body weight limited in some way, you want to hopefully get your body weight down a month or preferably 2 months beforehand, before the training gets as extreme or specified as possible, so that you can eat more consistently at a higher calorie level to sustain performance, avoid injury, and also get the right training adaptations that you're really looking for. But if you have to get down in body weight, it is what it is. You just kind of have to do what you have to do. No problem, Caleb. Oh, that's cool, Charlotte. Very, very cool. Were you getting your undergrad there at the same time? I see that's a 4-year span from 09 to 13. I started in 14, so just missed each other, I guess. Let's see, what else we got? Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate it. Caleb, question on abs. Good question. I already covered that one actually, but hopefully you got the answer to it. Back fatigue. All right, April, I see your question here about your gym hosting a lighter weight, high rep class. You like the music, you like the group activity, but would it be better to lift heavy instead? Currently doing a cut. Depending on how far in the cut you are, it might be good to do both to a certain extent. A lightweight, high rep class is going to do really good as far as calorie expenditure. If you're trying to finish up a cut, that's a good way to do it. Most of the time with my clients, I try to get them to hold off on cardio, because if you do cardio all the time, it becomes the norm. Your body expects it, it's adjusted to it, and it gets efficient at it. So that means that you're not going to be burning the same amount of calories compared to if you started walking 30 minutes a month ago, and now you're still walking a 30-minute time limit at the same rate, etc. You're not going to be burning as many calories because you've adjusted to it. You've become efficient. It might have taken you 300 calories to complete that task before, whereas now it could be 150 just from being better at it, and maybe being more coordinated or just adapted in general. So I try to get my clients to use cardio later in the process, and honestly, most of the best transformations that I've ever had, as far as clients, before and after pictures that I post a lot on there, they never did any cardio, and a lot of them didn't necessarily have to drop a lot of weight to have significant shifts in body composition. So don't always believe the scale. Sometimes it does lie to you, especially if your pants are fitting differently. I have people take waist circumference and hip circumference measures to make sure we have a good idea of what's going on as far as how body fat is distributed in the body, how that's changing. And even if the scale doesn't change, if you lose 5 inches off your waist and your body weight stays up, you've had a significant shift in body composition. It's not as unlikely as you might think, depending on your background and how you're entering into that phase. So, long story short, if it's helping you burn calories towards the end of a cut, I would say go for it. But if you're going into maintenance, you might want to step back on the cardio in general, just to make sure that you're not suppressing the muscle gains that I talked about earlier with interfering with those adaptation signals. Tim, what is the biggest mistake that athletes transitioning from strength sports into grappling tend to make? Or grappling, not grappling. I'm probably making them right now. I'm just a year into it, and I feel like the biggest idiot in the world when I'm rolling. So it's in jiu-jitsu specifically. I know what you're talking about. Probably, I would think so far the biggest mistake that I made was thinking I could walk in after 10 years of being a pro powerlifter and just muscle people around and basically outstrong people and beat lower belts and be competitive there. It didn't take long in my definitely the first session. I had a purple belt that was about my size, and he absolutely toyed with me because I didn't know what I was doing. And then I was like, okay, well, no big deal. That's somebody my own size. He's practiced a lot, and then I ended up getting beat by a white belt who's lowest ranked, probably weighed 50 pounds less than me, had only been training 6 months, but it was still, the difference in levels is really, really steep. So I think that would be the biggest mistake people would make if they're anything like me. Thanks, Dennis. I don't always feel pretty, but I can depend on you for that. Scrolling through these comments right now. All right, Summer. Good question. I've worked with people a lot with this, and it's definitely a story close to my heart. What is the best way to build shoulder strength with floating shoulder blades? It causes headaches and shoulder pain after overhead work. Trying to build up so I can avoid injury. Very, very good. The biggest thing that I can recommend with that, first off, if you're ever getting that checked out by a doctor, you'll need to follow their instructions first and foremost. Anybody that's doing PT for you, follow their instructions and be patient. The shoulder issues that I had specifically came from joint dysplasia, which I have all over my body. I found that out very young because I had a lot of shoulder and hip dislocations in sports growing up. specifically in high school. But basically all that is if you have a ball and socket joint, this is the socket, and then you have something like your femur or your humerus, it's ball and socket, it has a multi-directional joint, and it goes in and it's limited by the joint walls around it, so it can't really go anywhere. It can rotate, but it can't go past those areas. With joint dysplasia, your joints open up more like this, so it's very shallow, and they can start sliding around and being unstable. And on top of that, I was very thin, and that tends to be a lot of the symptoms that people with shoulder instability have. You're thinner, and then you have more shallow joints, so those things tend to move around a lot. And it took me years and years and years of basically having to swallow my pride and start pressing really, really light weights overhead and doing some rotator cuff work, but I actually had to avoid stretching for a while just to allow the tissues to tighten up after all the injuries, because everything was so stretched out and loose as far as the tissue around my shoulders. But eventually it did get better. You just have to focus on having good form and not driving with your legs on overhead movements or any kind of shoulder pressing and things like that. But I can't tell you how long I just pressed the bar over my head and accumulated strength little by little until eventually I was able to press 250 pounds over my head. And with bad shoulders, I was pretty happy with that. Eventually I was able to do a push jerk with 352 pounds over my head, but it all started with just saying, okay, I'm starting from ground zero, my shoulders are awful, they're weak, and pressing lightweight for a lot of reps and high volume, trying to build the muscle up in those specific areas. Great question, though. Glad you asked that. Brittany, glad to see you on here. I saved one of your questions from before, so I'll try and address both of them. You said, my strong suit in CrossFit is the heavy lifting, Olympic lifts. 156 pounds right now. You've lost 6 pounds since you started 2 weeks ago and have 14 pounds left in a 10-week cut to reach your goal. How much of a loss in strength should I suspect for my heavy lifts? Will be substantial. You haven't seen any strength loss so far. There are two main factors when we're talking about strength loss, or what's considered a strength loss on a cut phase. And one is with lower calories, you're basically having less fuel to perform work. So that is going to lower your ability to express your potential strength. From one day to the next, if you have more carbohydrates and you have low carbohydrates on another day, you're still kind of the same person as far as your potential for strength. But when you have more carbohydrates, you can realize that potential when you intentionally lower those carbohydrates or any other energy macros in general, total calories especially, you're not going to have the ability to express your potential strength. So that's a big thing to keep in mind, and it really messes with people in a cut phase when you feel like you're just losing strength left and right, but it's really, you're in a state and you're in a calorie deficit, which by definition means that you are low on energy. You have not taken in enough calories to sustain the activity that you're doing as far as energy expenditure, which is the goal. But because of that, you really need to understand that with that dip in strength that you feel, it's not necessarily as real as you feel like it is. As soon as you start having carbs again consistently, that strength comes back because you can actually realize your potential strength at that point. The other aspect of that, especially for people who go from thicker to thinner around the midsection, a lot of that is going to cause a change in leverages. And people, who are basically built like fire hydrants have an easier job squatting because the leverages there are much more favorable, and you can have better support coming out of the bottom of the squat as opposed to someone with a thinner waist, because you don't have as much stability or the kind of the core strength to make up for that lack of thickness around the midsection. So if you're going to be losing inches around your waist, you should probably expect a little bit of decrease in your squat numbers. and likely your bench press too, because that'll increase the range of motion. If you lose a little bit of fat off your back, like it comes off uniformly, like I talked about before. If you lose mass off your back, just in body fat, the muscle doesn't need to change, and you lose fat mass off your anterior portions, that's a funny way to put that. You go down, you're actually going to increase your range of motion. I actually measured that in my dissertation for my PhD. We tracked fat loss for the case study subject that I was using, and their range of motion, as they dropped down to a lower weight class, the range of motion actually increased 4 centimeters. So even though the weight that they lifted was the same, they actually moved it farther, which showed an increase in relative strength compared to the body weight, and also more work being done with that weight, even though the total weight didn't change. So you can definitely say that they technically got stronger and could express more strength, but it didn't show up on the barbell specifically. Struggling with tricep strength while you're on a cut, that's kind of one of those things as well. You're low on calories, and it's just going to be harder to express that potential strength that you have. Once you start eating again, back on maintenance, or perhaps eventually onto a mass plan, you're going to be able to see those strength gains start coming back, and you'll probably progress really well from there. All right, Heather, it's a good question. Working on 2-a-days. How do I adjust, if any, on my meal timing if I train in the AM and then again at night? Very good question. A lot of that has to do with the kind of training that you're doing. And a lot of people do cardio-oriented things in the morning. That doesn't necessarily require a training shake with the carbs and the protein and stuff like that. Most of the time, if I have clients that are doing morning cardio or like a morning WOD that's just fast and you get over in about 15 minutes, I'll have them have a meal before training, and instead of having the training shake and things like that, I'll just take the meal that would normally come after that and use it as a post-training meal, something kind of sweet and a good protein source, low fat. And with the bigger training session in the evening, then you would have, like your heavier hypertrophy-based work or strength-based work and things like that. So at that point, you would start using the training shake again, because the calories are really justified then. Asha May, I hope I'm saying that right. If I'm not, I apologize. With the men's physique templates and resulting gym times are much shorter than the women's. Is there a reason for this? I now follow the men's template, but wondered if I'm potentially sacrificing, what's the rest of that? Potential results doing this. I do find men's give me great results with calf definition than women's. The biggest difference in general with male and female training programs, it's way more correlated to strength levels. Now, if you look at statistics, just the average strength of men and women, they're a fair amount different. So those populations are being reflected in that way. Specifically with higher total sets and reps in general, with weaker people or beginners, or people who don't have as many androgenic hormones in their body. Men's testosterone production is normally higher than women's by a significant margin. Doing more sets and reps, simply because in relative to your weight, or your total lean mass especially, you're going to be able to do a lot more sets and reps because the weight is going to be lower, and you won't be able to accumulate damage as fast as you would if you were stronger, per unit of muscle, whatever you want to call it, and you actually accumulate damage a lot faster. If you do a 5x10 and you're the exact same size as someone else, if you do it with 100 pounds, and that's 100% effort as much as you could do, and they do it with 200 pounds, and that's 100% effort as much as they can do, same exact size, the other person is actually going to accumulate more fatigue. because there's still the same amount of limited resources. And that's with everything else being equal. And that's the kind of changes that you see with people as they get stronger in general. So if you have a female that's exactly as strong as a male with exactly as just as much lean body tissue, then you're actually going to see the same kind of training adaptations and also the damage accumulation as well. So it's not necessarily male-female. It's about on average stronger, on average weaker. So if you already have a really high strength level, you might benefit from the men's templates better. I suspect that might be what the issue is. All right, Nicholas, how do you feel about the philosophy of if it fits my macros, it works? Specifically when it comes to carbs, are all carbs created equal? 15 grams of different carbs, veggies, etc., etc. It's a great question. If it fits my macros, most everyone's heard of that kind of diet concept, and that's really kind of the start of where RP comes from. Is you have to get your total calories right. That's priority number one. Then you set your macros, and that's kind of where if it fits your macros ends to a certain extent. I think they have other general recommendations for that, but past that, when you start getting into the specific timing, nutrition timing is what we focus on a whole lot because it can actually make a big difference. Believe it or not. I know our chart is kind of misleading in that way, but it's only because people fail to get their calories right and they fail to get their macros right. If you don't have those right, the timing doesn't matter as much. So it's more of a prerequisite than it is a lack of it being a significant change. And even if it's only a 10% increase, if you look at elite athletes, 10% is the difference between winning Olympic gold sometimes and not going to the Olympics at all. So that's one of those things. It's, keep that in perspective. If you really want to get everything that you can out of a nutrition plan, you really have to do the nutrition timing appropriately. And as far as carbs being created equal, no. Actually, the nutrition plans that I write, I have 3 different kinds of carbohydrates most of the time. I like to divvy it up. One big reason is that I enjoy eating sweet stuff, having candy or pastry or something like that. If you can find a low-fat pastry or anything like a fig Newton bar, that's always the kind of a standard moderate to high glycemic index carbohydrate. You can have those around training time, or if you need a quick source of energy to support performance in an early training session in the morning. It works kind of like training carbs, but training carbs are absolutely the highest you can go on the glycemic index, which means it gets digested and turned into blood glucose faster. So the energy is there quicker, but with super sugary stuff and refined sugars, if you have it too fast or too much all at once, you will jack your blood sugar up, and what happens after your blood sugar shoots up is insulin goes up, and it drives your blood sugar back down, so you start feeling lethargic. And even though insulin is the most anabolic hormone in the body that we have, it's really, in that point, it's kind of hindering performance in training, and it's going to make you feel like shit, honestly. But if you don't like those spikes, or if you have sweet stuff and, even a little bit, sipping on your training shake during training, if that makes you feel lethargic, then maybe you need to have a lower glycemic carb in general. A healthy carb that we'll have away from training is below a 55 on the glycemic index scale. If you just search glycemic index, I believe it's the University of Sydney in Australia has an incredible database of carbohydrates and their associated glycemic index scores. I use that all the time, and I can't tell you how many foods there are on there. They're all carbohydrate based, but you can filter it by different carbohydrate GI scores, and you can see the differences there. But basically, low GI carbohydrates, they're going to cause a slower increase of blood sugar, whereas sugary super high GI carbs are going to cause spikes in blood glucose, and then the corresponding insulin response comes along after that. And if your blood sugar only goes up to here because it's trending slowly, you're only going to have a small release of insulin. That's kind of what you want away from training. After training, we want that insulin response go into that food coma if possible, because that's when insulin is storing all that muscle, the blood glucose, turning it into muscle glycogen, and it also helps to get a good nap there too. Tyler, I see your question on there. Appreciate you jumping in. What effect does large quantities of cardio have on ability to gain and maintain muscle mass? For example, 15% female to today 19% trains multiple times a day, up to 3 and 4 times weightlifting and high cardio. Particularly for women, there's a lot of literature out there, and this is excluding anyone who takes the super supplements, any kind of anabolic steroids or anything like that, because that does change the training adaptations considerably. But without that kind of support, especially on average with women, the training adaptations will get nullified because you're doing so much endurance-based work. It accumulates fatigue, and without the hormone support there, you start developing more type 1 fibers and the very, very low end of type 2 fibers. With the weight training, you're going to have type 2 fibers anyway, but you're not going to be meeting those high threshold type 2X fibers, which if you're in weightlifting, you really want those, because that's where the power comes from, especially if you're in a weight class sport. We talked about that earlier. But the additional fatigue and repetitive cardio-based movement is actually going to buffer the physiological signaling to keep those type 2 fibers, the high threshold fibers, from accumulating or being adapted to from the training. Yeah. Let's see. What else do we have on here? All right, Nicole just jumped on. My question is, I don't like to eat before I work out. Work out in the mornings. However, I also coach before I work out. If I'm up at 4, coaching at 5:30 and 6:30, then working out at, there's more to that one. That's a long one. Good grief. Working out at 7:30, is it okay if I lie to the app and push out my wake up time so I can have my first meal 30 minutes after my workout? I know I've been up almost 4 hours before I eat and drink, and et cetera, et cetera. Basically, you don't want to do it. There are a lot of people who feel that way. I don't like eating early in the morning, but unfortunately for us in that camp, it does make a big difference. Having especially carbohydrates earlier in the day before your workout is going to change how insulin sensitive you are for up to this is crazy to me, because it's out there in the research. The president of the NSCA, I think it was one of the guys that was up for election for the president of the NSCA, gave this nutrition talk. And I went and looked at the research he was referencing, and it was true. Having carbohydrates earlier in the day actually increases your insulin sensitivity and your metabolic stimulus as far as the uptick in overall metabolism for up to 2 days, 24 to 48 hours. They've seen increased rates up to that long. So if you are not eating for 4 hours after you wake up, you're genuinely missing a very, very important window. And I know it sucks to hear it, and it sucks to go through with it, but you do eventually get used to it. I think the key for most people in that situation, including myself, is finding something that's easily palatable as soon as you wake up, and especially if you don't have a protein source in the morning. Having those available amino acids that have already been used up while you were sleeping, that's the quicker you can get those in your body, the quicker you're going to come out of a catabolic state where your body is essentially eating itself, because all the amino acids and protein that you had before you went to bed, hopefully you had a casein and protein shake that lasts about 6 hours. If you sleep 8 hours, that's 2 hours that your body doesn't have extra materials to build onto what you have, and it's having to take those materials or amino acids away from other parts of your body to remodel the parts that you trained. So with the deficit in protein, and then the insulin sensitivity to carbohydrates, and being able to store those and perform well, it does make a big difference. So my advice would be, unfortunately, suck it up, eat that food in the morning. It does make a big difference. Let's see, what else we got here? All right. We've got going about, 50 minutes so far? Is that about right? I can't see a clock on this one. We'll take a few more questions. You guys will toss them in the comments, and I will see if I have anything else that I really needed to cover. Thanks, Craig. Do I find it harder to get out of a north-south choke or an old Inzer Leviathan? Definitely the Inzer Leviathan. You can't tap out to a canvas squat suit. So, and I've been stuck in those for half an hour before. You tap to a choke in jiu-jitsu, and they'll generally let go, but the squat suit just did not care. No problem, Nicole, my pleasure. Very happy to help you guys as much as I can. Let's see, who else do we have here? This is a good question. A lot of my clients, not a lot, but a fair amount of clients, I have work third shift, or like nighttime nurse or healthcare professionals, or really any kind of job that goes overnight, and you have shift changes that go from third to second to first, and it's really, really hard on circadian rhythm and getting quality sleep at that point. But the question is, how do you change or make adjustments when you have shift changes like that, and you're actually up for longer than normal people would be up? If you sleep in a 24-hour window, you're up for 16 hours. What happens when you actually have to go to work in a third shift and you're used to second shift, and you actually stay up an extra 8 or 10 hours? And first off, that sucks, and I salute you guys. You're much tougher than me. I've pulled some all-nighters before, but doing that on the regular, like firefighters do, and EMS people, you have my respect for sure, for so many reasons, but that's just one of the reasons. A good way to think about the concept of adjusting your plan is, if you are awake 4 hours longer than you would normally be awake, you are up, and you are moving around, burning calories, and just normal activity. If you're just awake an extra 4 hours, then you should have a normal meal, and by that I mean a meal that's far away from training that's on your templates. So every 4 hours, 4 to 5 hours or so, you should have an extra meal. And the reason for that is we're trying to keep, on one aspect, we're trying to keep a consistent source of amino acids flowing through your digestive system, and then that gets into your bloodstream. Now, I talked about this with the sleep issue before, and not eating after you wake up. When you don't have that amino acid resource in the bloodstream, your body is going to go into a catabolic state and start eating itself for whatever procedures it needs to go through, whether it's recovery or mental things or just whatever needs to be done. Your body will have to eat itself, and then you have stress hormones that go up, anabolic hormones go down, and then your metabolism overall is being downregulated to function at a lower rate, because you don't have the fuel or the building blocks for your body to adapt and adjust to what it's doing. So basically every 4 or 5 hours that you're up extra in a day, toss one of those meals in there and you should be just fine. Well, thank you, Nicole and Summer. I wish I could do this every day. I really want to do it a lot more frequently. And after this Q&A session is over, feel free to drop more questions in the comments and I'll try and save those for the next one. I really like to do this once a week, but if we can get that going, that would be awesome. But, let's see if we have anything else pressing. Summer, I see another question about sleep there. A lot of people have different sleep issues, and I'm definitely not an expert on sleep quality. But one of the things that I'll ask first when I have a client that has issues with sleep is if they've tried a ZMA supplement, which is zinc magnesium aspartate. It is one of the few proven supplements that actually does what it says it's supposed to do. And all it is a very simple mineral support, which we seem to use more of while we sleep. And once those resources of that specific combination of minerals is depleted in our bodies while we sleep, sleep quality doesn't seem to be as good or as deep. So it should help you get more REM sleep at night. And, on average, if you sleep 7 hours without taking ZMA compared to 7 hours with ZMA, you should feel better and more rested as long as there aren't any other issues at play, like, what's the word where you snore a lot? I forgot. It starts with an A. It'll come to me at some point. Feel free to comment below for that one. Sleep apnea, sorry. But if it's not that kind of issue where your airway's getting obstructed or maybe stimulants have an issue or a compounding factor with that, then I would suggest trying something like that. And if not, maybe go get a sleep study. Getting quality sleep, there's no replacement for that. You can't out train, you can't out nutrition, you can't out supplement that in any way. It's just that important. You got it, Daniel. Sleep apnea. Thanks. Last one I think I'll cover was from Cindy, and said she's really struggling with the concept of going into a mass phase, and that is not out of the ordinary whatsoever. There are tons and tons of factors that go into that, especially with the social implications for women. It seems like so many of the ladies that I work with, you feel a lot of pressure and you get all kinds of anxiety when you think about gaining weight in general. And it's really the social stigma that's pushed by, a lot of the media, the magazines and things like that. They don't talk about improving body composition very much ever. All they ever talk about is losing weight and gaining weight. And one's very good and one's absolutely horrible, and you should, run for the hills if that ever starts to happen. No pun intended. Running for cardio. But one of the big things that we have really, really good articles on this. I believe Lori Shaw wrote some good articles, and Dr. Mel Davis did as well, and Dr. Jen Case. A lot of these ladies, very experienced, very knowledgeable, and very wise. So any of the work that they have put out, I would definitely look into it. There's so many good things that they've put out about specifically women's health in general, and there will be more. They crank out great content. But when you think about long-term sustainability with body composition, the biggest mistake that I see women tend to make because of those, social pressures and the anxiety of thinking about gaining weight is when you think about, okay, I'm going to lose weight and get down to, X amount of pounds. The biggest thing that happens there is everybody thinks, okay, go do cardio immediately and do lots of it and just burn all the fat away. And that might work for a while. But over time, if you reduce your eating and you just do cardio, you'll lose body fat as long as you're doing all that cardio. Even if you eat very little after that, your body gets used to that calorie expenditure and functioning on low calories. It's going to suppress your metabolic rate in general. And what that means is as soon as you stop doing the cardio, or even while you're still doing it, your body will get much more efficient at doing those tasks, and you'll start storing body fat significantly. And when that happens, there's really only one way to go. You have to figure out how to stimulate your metabolism again. And what that requires is resistance training. So if you think about lean body mass, or lean tissue in general, specifically contractile tissue in your muscles, what that is, if you have this much, just say your muscle's this big. If you have this much, it will burn X amount of calories in general, just to be sustained, to hold on to that muscle. If you have a muscle that is this big, it will require significantly more calories to sustain that muscle. And what essentially you have is an analogy for a car engine. The bigger car engine, most of the time, requires more fuel just to let it run normally. You crank it up, it sits at idle, not doing anything. If you have a big V8, racing engine versus a little 4-cylinder engine that's in a Honda Civic or something, it takes so much more fuel to run that big engine, even if it's not doing anything. Thinking about resting metabolic rates there, basal metabolic rates. It takes so much more fuel just to do the simple things that your calorie expenditure is way higher than if you have little muscle. So, for basically everyone, you need to gain muscle and lean body mass in general to keep your metabolic rate high, so that when you start eating normally, which is our goal in the maintenance phase, to stabilize your weight at that new set point, you have to have muscle to keep your metabolism up and to keep you from just gaining that weight back. Because not only is it going to take more calories to sustain that, you're going to have hormone shifts that are much more anabolic. Your testosterone will go up. Estrogen might get a little bit lower, which won't cause any health issues, but it does create a much more anabolic environment in the body. So you can hold on to muscle, you're burning through calories faster, you can eat more, and you can be healthier in general if you take that approach instead of just trying to do everything with cardio. Now, the mass phase that we were talking about, that's when that happens. It's going to set you up for success for life instead of, oh my gosh, I just gained 10 pounds in 3 months, which would be a very reasonable amount of weight to gain in something like that. A very good rate of gain if you're lifting and trying to gain muscle that way. And once you maintain there, you kind of change your metabolic set point where your body is adapted to being that size. And then you move into a cut phase later. Not only are you going to need more calories to sustain where you were because of the muscle increase, you're going to be potentiated, so to speak, or have a higher sensitivity to the drop in calories because your metabolic rate is already so high. So your cut calories might even end up being way more than you started on with base the first time you tried to do a cut. And you're going to lose weight from it because you're burning more calories. So don't be afraid to get in the weight room and potentiate your eventual leanness that's easier to sustain for the rest of your life by doing a massing phase and trying to gain muscle, increasing the size of your car engine so it takes more fuel, and you'll definitely be a lot more successful doing it that way in the long run, and you'll be a lot happier and less stressed. And life's too short not to be strong anyway, so it helps you feel good. But I really appreciate you guys hanging around for this one. It looks like we've gone over an hour now. It always flies by. So thank you for all the questions, and I will catch you guys again another time. Take care.